we build everything here from Superbird's original stuff, and then we got one section of our business up here just modifies new cars.
A ton of power.
There's a building in Level Cross, North Carolina, that most people will never see the inside of. It sits on the same property where one of the greatest dynasties in American motorsport history was built, maintained, and ultimately completed across more than 4 decades of racing. Collectors have flown in from across the country to make offers on what is inside it. Museums have sent representatives with serious institutional budgets and genuine preservation intentions. Documentary filmmakers have requested access. Richard Petty has said no to all of them, every single time, without exception and without apparent regret. What is stored inside that garage is not hidden because of secrecy or ego or because Petty is trying to manufacture mystique around his legacy. It is closed because some things belong to the people who live them, and Richard Petty decided a long time ago that the contents of that building fall into that category. Once you understand what is actually in there and what it costs to accumulate it, that decision starts to make a very particular kind of sense. To appreciate why the contents of that garage carry the weight they do, you first have to reckon honestly with the scale of what Richard Petty actually accomplished in NASCAR, because the numbers involved are so far outside the range of anything that came before or after him that they require a moment of genuine attention. 200 wins in the NASCAR Cup Series. That is the figure that defines his career and separated him from every other driver who ever sat behind a wheel in that competition. The next closest driver in the record books is David Pearson, with 105 victories. Richard Petty has nearly double the wins of the second most successful Cup Series driver in the history of the sport. He won 7 championships. He won the Daytona 500 7 times. He started 1,184 races across a career that stretched from 1958 to 1992. He recorded 513 consecutive starts between 1971 and 1989. These are not numbers that have been gradually approached by subsequent generations of drivers with better equipment and more sophisticated technology. They sit untouched in the record books because nothing in the sport's evolution has produced anyone capable of coming near them. When people describe Richard Petty as the king of NASCAR, they are not using an honorary title as a courtesy. They are describing a statistical reality that has no serious challenger anywhere in the sport's history. Petty Enterprises, the family racing operation founded by his father Lee Petty in Level Cross in 1949, was a foundation everything else was built on. Lee won 3 championships of his own before Richard took over the famous number 43 car and turned it into the most recognizable vehicle in American motorsport. Richard's brother Maurice engineered the engines that powered the majority of those 200 victories, developing mechanical solutions in a small North Carolina shop that competitive teams with far larger budgets consistently fail to match. Dale Inman, Richard's cousin, served as his crew chief for most of his career and developed a working partnership with him that spanned decades of racing at the highest level. For members of the same family from the same small town, all of whom were eventually inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, building and racing and winning on a compound in Level Cross that still stands today. The private garage on that property is where the physical remnants of all of it ended up and where they have remained ever since. Richard Petty has been candid in interviews about the fact that preserving race cars was not something anyone in the sport thought seriously about during the years when he was actively competing and winning. A race car that had served its purpose was a financial asset that could be converted into resources for building the next one. Cars that sold to smaller teams, stripped down for usable components, or simply abandoned in fields when they were too far gone to justify the effort of moving them. Petty has said openly that he sold cars to West Coast racing operations during the 1960s and 1970s for whatever the market would bear at the time, because no one in the garage was thinking about what those vehicles might represent to collectors or historians 30 years later. The ones that stayed in Level Cross stayed not because of any deliberate preservation strategy, but because circumstances kept them there, stacked in a field adjacent to the main garage, sitting in North Carolina, weathered through seasons that were not kind to bare metal and aging bodywork. He has estimated the number at somewhere between 15 and 20 cars in that pile, untouched and unlabeled, representing a volume of racing history that no formal institution has ever been allowed to properly assess. The vehicles that ended up inside the garage rather than the field outside it are there for different reasons, And understanding the difference between those two categories is essential to understanding what the closed garage actually means. Cars left outside to weather were effectively abandoned. Cars brought inside and kept were preserved because of what they represented to the specific people who drove and built them, not because of any calculation about future market value. The distinction between those two motivations produces completely different kinds of objects. An object kept because it might be worth something is an investment. An object kept because discarding it would mean losing something irreplaceable is something else entirely. And the garage in Level Cross is full of the second kind. Two vehicles inside that garage sit at opposite ends of Richard Petty's career, and together they communicate something about the arc of it more efficiently than any formal museum display could manage. The first is the Plymouth Superbird from 1970, one of the most visually distinctive race cars ever built for a competition on American oval tracks. Chrysler's racing division developed it with a specific engineering purpose, using an elongated nose cone and a towering rear wing to manage aerodynamic forces at the speeds NASCAR superspeedways demanded. It was not a styling exercise. Every unusual element of the Superbird's appearance existed because the physics of racing at nearly 200 miles per hour required it. Petty won 18 races in Plymouth products during the 1970 season, and the Superbird became associated with him in a way that made it one of the most iconic images in the sport's visual history. The car sitting in the Level Cross garage has not been restored or prepared for exhibition. Tire rubber still adheres to the undercarriage from races run decades ago. The bodywork carries contact marks from racing incidents that were never repaired because the car was retired rather than returned to competition. It exists in the condition it was in when it last turned a competitive lap, which is precisely the condition that gives it its authenticity and its significance. The other car is older and carries no glamour whatsoever, which is part of what makes it so important. It is a 1957 Oldsmobile, constructed by hand by Lee Petty and his sons in the family garage in Level Cross, and it is the vehicle in which Richard Petty made his NASCAR debut as a 20-year-old driver who had grown up watching his father race and had spent years learning the mechanical foundations of the sport in the same building where the car was built. It is rusted in the way that steel rusts when it is stored because of meaning rather than maintained because of value. The Superbird represents the summit of what Richard Petty became at the height of his dominance. The 1957 Oldsmobile represents the moment before any of it was established, when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and the only thing available to work with was family, determination, and whatever could be fabricated in a small shop in North Carolina. Both cars sit in the same building. Neither has been offered for sale. Beyond the cars, the contents of the garage extend into territory that no auction estimate can adequately account for. Former employees of Petty Enterprises have described over the years a backroom within the main garage structure where items too personal for any public display were set aside and kept. The details that have emerged from those descriptions paint a picture of accumulated private history that reflects the full emotional cost of 4 decades at the highest level of a dangerous sport. There are boxes of fan mail from the 1960s and 1970s, correspondence from people across the country who found something in watching Richard Petty race that connected to their own lives in ways they felt compelled to put into writing. Letters from children, letters from military veterans, letters from ordinary people in ordinary circumstances who wanted a stranger in North Carolina to know what his racing meant to them. Petty kept them, not because he had plans to respond to them or display them, but because throwing them away was never something he was prepared to do. Items connected to Dale Earnhardt Sr. are also reportedly among the things kept in that back room. Earnhardt and Petty were rivals across 2 decades of competition. 2 men with fundamentally different personalities and driving philosophies who nonetheless developed a mutual respect rooted in the shared understanding of what it actually takes to compete at that level for that long. When Earnhardt died on the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, the loss reverberated through NASCAR in ways the sport is still processing more than 2 decades later. What Petty kept from his relationship with Earnhardt is not something he has described publicly in detail. The people who have seen those items describe them not as memorabilia collected from a famous rival, but as objects held onto because the person they represented was someone Petty genuinely understood and genuinely lost. The crash frame from a 1980 Pocono Raceway accident is also reportedly stored in that back room in the condition it was in when it came out of the wreckage. That accident sent Petty's car airborne and through a series of barrel rolls that absorbed an impact severe enough to end careers and lives in motorsport. He walked away from it. The frame was kept as it was recovered, unstraightened and uncleaned. A record of a specific afternoon at a specific track, with a margin between continuing and not continuing was visible in the bent metal of the chassis. No public explanation for keeping it has ever been offered. The people who have stood in front of it have suggested that the explanation presents itself immediately when you are actually in the room with it. The financial dimension of the closed garage is worth understanding clearly because it illuminates what Petty's consistent refusal to sell actually represents. People with genuine expertise in racing memorabilia and automotive history who have assessed portions of the collection have suggested that the total value, accounting for the cars, the personal artifacts, the race documentation, and the historical significance of the provenance attached to everything in the building, could reach $10 million or more under the right market conditions. Those assessments have been accompanied by serious offers from serious buyers. Private collectors with the resources to make credible proposals have approached him. Institutions interested in acquiring pieces for permanent or rotating exhibition have made their interest known through proper channels. None of those conversations produced a transaction. Petty turned down every offer that came during the financially difficult years when Petty Enterprises was struggling to remain competitive in a sport that had become enormously expensive and corporately structured. He turned them down when the contents of the garage represented the most accessible financial resource available to him. The objects in that building were never going to become liquidity, regardless of what the balance sheet looked like, because that was never what they were for. The death of Adam Petty in May 2000 changed the emotional context of everything connected to that garage in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. Adam was Kyle Petty's son and Richard Petty's grandson, 20 years old and already competing professionally, the fourth generation of the Petty family in NASCAR, and the first fourth-generation professional athlete in any American sport. He died during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway when a mechanical failure sent his car into the outside wall at racing speed. Richard Petty has spoken about losing Adam with the careful precision of someone who measures every word, because none of the available ones are quite adequate to reality of what happened. Kyle Petty has described how his son's death restructured his entire understanding of what the family legacy meant and what deserved to be protected within it. The garage in Level Cross was already a deeply personal space before 2000. After Adam, the idea of converting any part of it into something available for commercial interest or public consumption became something the family was simply not interested in considering. Richard Petty turned 86 years old in 2024. He still appears at the Level Cross compound. He still wears the cowboy hat and the dark sunglasses that became as much a part of his public identity as the number 43 on the car door. He still signs autographs for fans who make the trip to North Carolina, and by every account from people who have encountered him in that context, he is warm, present, and genuinely glad they came. The Petty Museum, which his late wife Linda established in 1988, and which handles the public dimension of the family's racing history, offers visitors a thorough and carefully organized record of what Petty Enterprises accomplished across 4 decades. It contains the championship cars and the trophies and the racing equipment that Petty was willing to share with the audiences who helped build his career. The private garage contains what he was not willing to share, and the line between those two categories is the most honest thing he has ever communicated about what it actually cost to do what he did. The most statistically dominant career in the history of American motorsport ended in 1992, and the man who built it went home to Level Cross and put the things that mattered most to him in a building and closed the door. Not to protect their financial value, not to create a mystique that would serve some future commercial purpose. Because some of what those 40 years actually required of him and his family is not something that belongs in public record, and Richard Petty understood that clearly enough to act on it every single time someone asked him to open that door and he chose not to. What is inside that garage is not just cars and trophies and old mail. It is the private cost of a public legend, kept exactly where it belongs.